At the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea, off the southern coasts of Greece, there exists a city that is 5,000 years old. These are not scattered ruins or pottery fragments spread across the seabed. They are streets laid out with recognizable urban planning, buildings with their walls still standing, tombs where the dead of a civilization were buried that flourished when the Egyptian pyramids were barely beginning to be built, and squares where a complete community lived, worked, and died millennia ago. All of it submerged under just 3 or 4 meters of water, so close to the surface that a recreational diver can swim over its streets with relative ease, and so well preserved that the archaeologists who have studied it have had to revise some of their most basic assumptions about urban development in prehistoric Greece. It is called Pavlopetri, and it is considered the oldest known submerged city in the world to date. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. Let us begin. The history of the discovery of Pavlopetri is in itself a fascinating account that spans more than a century and perfectly illustrates how scientific knowledge advances cumulatively, with contributions that sometimes take decades to be recognized and valued in their proper dimension. The first documented record of the existence of submerged structures in that area of the coast of Laconia in the Greek Peloponnese dates back to 1904, when Greek geologist Phocion Negris observed the ruins underwater and recorded them in his notes. However, Negris's observation did not at that moment generate the systematic scientific follow-up it deserved, and the structures he had identified remained unstudied in any rigorous manner for more than 60 years, known to local fishermen and inhabitants, but ignored by international academic archaeology. It was in 1967 that Pavlopetri received the scientific attention it deserved, thanks to the work of British oceanographer Nicholas Fleming from the University of Southampton. Fleming dove into the waters off the small island of Pavlopetri in Vatica Bay in the south of the Laconia region, and what he found immediately made him aware that he was before something of extraordinary archaeological importance. He was not seeing the scattered remains of some building that had fallen into the sea through coastal erosion, nor the fragments of an ancient port destroyed by an earthquake. He was seeing a city with an extension of approximately 50,000 square meters, with streets that followed a deliberate and planned layout, with buildings of different sizes and functions that could be identified with relative clarity even after millennia of immersion, and with a state of preservation that made systematic archaeological study of the site possible. Fleming returned to the site in 1968 accompanied by a team of archaeologists, and together they conducted the first planimetric survey of Pavlopetri, drawing a map of the visible structures and collecting ceramic and other artifact samples that allowed a preliminary chronology of the settlement to be established. The results of that initial work were published and placed Pavlopetri on the World Archaeology Map as a site of primary importance, although the limitations of the technology available at that time prevented the study from going as deep as the archaeologists would have wished. What was established from those first investigations was that Pavlopetri was a Bronze Age settlement, with evidence of occupation going back at least to 2800 BCE, making it contemporary with the first phases of Minoan civilization in Crete and predating the Mycenaean civilization that would later dominate the Aegean world. The Bronze Age in the Eastern Mediterranean was one of the most dynamic and fascinating periods in the history of human civilization. Between approximately 3000 and 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was the scene of a commercial and cultural exchange system of surprising complexity, connecting Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, Cyprus, Crete, and mainland Greece in a network of maritime routes through which goods, ideas, technologies, and peoples circulated. The peoples who lived in Pavlopetri during that period were part of that interconnected world, and the city must have been a point of some importance in the maritime economy of the region, given its geographical location at the southern tip of the Peloponnese, in a position that placed it on the routes between the Western Mediterranean and the Eastern Mediterranean. The question that naturally arises when contemplating a 5,000-year-old city submerged beneath the Mediterranean is how it came to be there. The answer involves a combination of geological processes that operated over centuries. The coast of Laconia, like many Mediterranean coasts in the eastern region, has experienced tectonic movements over the millennia that have produced gradual subsidences of the land and rises in relative sea level. Pavlopetri was not submerged by a single catastrophic event such as a tsunami or an earthquake, although earthquakes may have accelerated the process at some point. it was progressively covered by water as the combination of rising sea levels in the Mediterranean and gradual coastal subsidence transformed what had been inhabited land into seabed. This process probably developed over several centuries, which would have given inhabitants time to gradually abandon the city and settle in higher areas, taking their valuable objects with them and leaving behind the permanent structures that today astonish archaeologists. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. In 2009, more than 4 decades after Nicholas Fleming's pioneering study, Pavlopetri received renewed and much more exhaustive scientific attention thanks to a joint project between the University of Nottingham and the Greek government. This project represented an enormous qualitative leap from previous investigations because it had technology that in 1967 was completely non-existent, and that allowed an analysis of the site of unprecedented depth and precision. The central objective of the project was to create a complete 3-dimensional map of Pavlopetri, documenting every structure, every street, every open space, and every identifiable object with the level of detail that only modern digital technology makes possible. The team used remotely operated underwater vehicles equipped with high-resolution sonar scanners and high-definition cameras to systematically map the entire extent of the archaeological site. The data collected by these instruments were processed using specialized software to create 3-dimensional models of the structures, allowing archaeologists to study the city plan with a clarity that no amount of hours of direct human diving could have provided. The result was the most complete and detailed map ever produced of Pavlopetri, a scientific document of enormous value that revealed details of the site that previous investigations had not been able to capture. What the 3-dimensional map revealed about Pavlopetri's urban organization is extraordinarily informative about the sophistication of its inhabitants. The city was not a disorganized accumulation of structures, but a planned settlement with recognizable urban logic. At least 15 large buildings have been identified that archaeologists interpret as residences of families or clans. Structures large enough to house extended family groups with their dependencies and storerooms. Among these main buildings extends a network of streets and alleys that connect the different areas of the city, with an organization that suggests the urban space was planned in a coordinated manner and not simply occupied spontaneously and disorganizedly. Spaces have also been identified that researchers interpret as squares or community gathering areas, places where the city's public life must have developed, where markets, religious celebrations, and collective deliberations were held that are characteristic of any organized community. There are tombs that document the funerary practices of Pavlopetri's inhabitants, and the variety of burial types identified suggests that the city had a long history and that funerary practices evolved over the centuries of occupation of the site. The grave goods recovered from some of those tombs include pottery and personal objects that allow not only dating of the burials, but also obtaining information about the living conditions, religious beliefs, and commercial connections of the inhabitants. The ceramics recovered at Pavlopetri are perhaps the most abundant and most informative type of evidence in the entire archaeological site. The fragments of vessels, amphoras, bowls, and jars that archaeologists have collected from the seabed span an extraordinarily long chronological period, from the final Neolithic, around 3500 BCE, to the late Hellenistic period, indicating that the site was occupied in a more or less continuous manner for more than 2,000 years. Some Mycenaean ceramic fragments, the characteristic style of the civilization that dominated Greece between approximately 1600 and 1200 BCE, are especially significant because Mycenaean ceramics are one of the best-studied archaeological markers of the Aegean world, and their presence at Pavlopetri confirms that the city was an active settlement integrated into the Mycenaean system during its period of maximum flourishing. The connection with Mycenaean civilization is one of the most fascinating aspects of Pavlopetri from a historical and cultural standpoint. The Mycenaeans are the Bronze Age Greeks, the builders of the palaces of Mycenae, Tiryns and Pylos that Schliemann and other 19th-century archaeologists found, and that revealed a civilization of a richness and complexity that 20th-century archaeology has been progressively unveiling. They are also, according to many researchers, the historical model underlying the Homeric poems, the heroes of Troy and the kingdoms sending their fleets across the Aegean in search of glory and plunder. Living in Pavlopetri during the Mycenaean period was to live in the same world as Agamemnon, Achilles, and Odysseus, though from the perspective of a provincial coastal community very different from the great palatial centers of the northern Peloponnese. There is something profoundly disturbing and at the same time profoundly beautiful in the fact that Pavlopetri has survived underwater while the great Mycenaean cities and palaces that surrounded it on the mainland were destroyed, looted, abandoned, and turned into ruins during the centuries following the collapse of Bronze Age civilization around 1200 BCE. The Palace of Mycenae, the center of Agamemnon's power, is today a set of semi-crumbling stone walls visited by tourists. Tiryns, Pylos, and the other Mycenaean palatial centers are ruins that require considerable imaginative effort to evoke what they were at their moment of splendor. But Pavlopetri, the small coastal city gradually covered by the sea, preserves its streets, buildings, and squares in a state that allows archaeologists to walk through them virtually, even if with mask and fins rather than sandals. The future of research at Pavlopetri is promising precisely because the technology that allows it to be studied without disturbing it continues to advance. Unlike land archaeological sites, where excavation is inevitably destructive because to reach the oldest layers the most recent must be removed, Pavlopetri can be studied by non-invasive techniques that document what exists without altering its position or context. Three-dimensional models, geophysical analyses of sediment, and advanced dating techniques are providing information that would have been inaccessible to previous generations of archaeologists. And each new research campaign adds additional layers of knowledge about a city that was inhabited for more than 2,000 years, and that holds in its submerged structures the history of countless generations of people who lived, loved, worked, and died in that corner of the Mediterranean before the sea covered them forever. Pavlopetri reminds us that human history is much longer, more complex, and richer than written records can capture, and that the ocean, far from being just an obstacle or a danger, is also one of the most extraordinary archives that humanity possesses, a place where the past is preserved with a fidelity that sometimes surpasses everything that time has left on the surface. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. Until next time.